Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with CGLR. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite you to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect, so follow those pages you see listed, and we'll begin shortly. Okay, hello again. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources and slides shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up message to all who registered. And finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. I'd also like to share this save the date for GLR Week 2023, which will run virtually from July 17th through the 21st. The theme this year is Bright Spots and Silver Linings, and we'll be having many exciting plenary and state-led sessions that we are sponsoring. Information will be posted in the chat box, and we hope you'll save the date. And lastly, I just want to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week on June 13th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a peer exchange conversation at 12:30 Eastern Time. Learning Begins at Home: How Housing Agencies Can Support Attendance and Engagement in School. The following webinar at 3 p.m. will be Nurture Connection, the Movement for Early Relational Health. And on June 20th, another exciting doubleheader, first with a funder-to-funder conversation on kindergarten as a sturdy bridge, and then another kindergarten session on strengthening kindergarten to improve children's pre-K through third grade experiences. Registration and information for these sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is Hattie Miles-Polka, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra. Welcome to everyone joining us. I could not be more excited about today's conversation, co-sponsored by Early Learning Nation magazine and the Bezos Family Foundation, following the science, bilingualism as an asset supporting early brain development. Given that the United States has no officially recognized official language, it is no surprise that multilingualism is an inseparable part of our national identity. Yet the conventional perception of bilingualism at an early age has not always been positive. For a long time, speaking languages other than English was discouraged in children in order to prevent confusion or academic delays. Research has shown, however, that this perception could not be further from the truth. Speaking multiple languages has many benefits for the brain related to cognition, executive function, gray and white matter, as well as social and cultural benefits. Early Learning Nation magazine recently published an article that I will link in the chat later, highlighting that bilingualism is in fact a resource, not a disability. This article sparked the idea for today's session, in which we will hear from experts about the landscape of bilingualism today, the brain science of bilingualism, the science of reading for English learners, and how we should approach teaching English learners. We are joined by Claude Goldenberg, Professor Emeritus at Stanford University, Viorica Marian, professor at Northwestern University, Martha Martinez, Senior Director of Research and Evaluation at Sobrato Early Academic Language, and Bob Stechik, Director of Early Childhood Education Initiatives at Unidos US. I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator, Lee Giangreco, who is a regular contributor to Early Learning Nation magazine. Thank you for being here, Lee.
Thanks so much for the great introduction, Hattie. We have a wonderful panel here today, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in, first with Bob.
So hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks to everyone for organizing the session, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. So I want to talk about early bilingual development in 2023 as a landscape. And within that metaphor, I want to talk about two aspects. Next slide, please. So parts of the landscape are toxic and parts are quite scenic. So where's the toxicity? Well, number one, we know from all the scientific evidence that the early years are the foundation for long-term reading success. Unfortunately, the people who work with children before the age of 5 are overwhelmingly underpaid for the nature and demands of their positions. A second condition of toxicity that we found, no, I'm sorry, go back. Sorry. A second feature that we found is that although many states and the federal and federally funded programs have increased teacher credentialing requirements in order to build quality within the field of early education, we found that many Latino teachers were being put in a position of obtaining a degree to hold on to their teaching position. The challenge we found was that their classrooms were 50%, 80%, 100% dual language learners. They were beginning and ending associate or bachelor degree programs, but their college coursework included no content information about dual language development or cultural responsiveness. So clearly, we need better policies and more leadership in the area of early childhood teacher preparation. Next slide, please. A second area of toxicity is that Latino families report frequent experiences with racism and discrimination. So last fall, the Unidos US, in conjunction with our partners Abriendo Puertas and BSP Research, conducted a national Latino family survey. We spoke with 1,300 people nationwide, Latino families with children under the age of 6. Unfortunately, 1 in 5 respondents indicated that their children encountered bullying or shaming for speaking Spanish, specifically within school settings within the last year. This is obviously a major toxic feature of the landscape. And then the third feature is that families experience negative information or misinformation regarding, yes, you can go ahead. Families experience negative or misinformation regarding early bilingualism. So in the last year, Unidos conducted 5 parent focus groups, San Antonio, Chicago, and Wilmington, Delaware. Everyone told us that they've come in contact with the idea that children are confused if they grow up with more than one language. Many of the parents in Texas told us, hey, that's the way we grew up. This idea that children are confused by more than one language, that's how we grew up. And when we went outside, our families often hid Spanish or minimized speaking to us in Spanish when we went outside the home. Next slide, please. We also encountered very specific experiences with misinformation. So 3 of the families in San Antonio told us their children were receiving speech therapy. So our original question was, has anyone in a school setting ever told you that children are confused if they grow up with 2 languages? And someone said, yes, my speech therapist. So we then asked, can you try and remember exactly what she said? That's where we got this quote. So the child had cochlear implants, they were removed. The speech therapist was saying, it's okay to speak English to the child, but don't bring any Spanish right now. You don't want to bring in any Spanish. You don't want to confuse him. 2 other parents in the focus group said, we're receiving the exact same message. So unfortunately, although we have a tidal wave of scientific evidence that clearly demonstrates that children are capable of dual language development, Latino families continue to receive specific experiences with misinformation. Now, the really bad news is that as we disseminate these findings, we find additional examples of the frequency of misinformation. So we took this quote to a presentation at the National Head Start Association Parent and Family Conference last December. We presented this quote on the screen. There were about 45 people in the room. And when we asked, have any of you had the same experience, at least a dozen people raised their hand. One woman told us, this is what happened to me when I was a child, and this is happening now to my 5-year-old. My 5-year-old is code switching, and the speech therapist is saying I need to stop speaking Spanish because the code switching is evidence of a disability. We took this quote to a teacher focus group in Oregon in February of this year. We had 24 participants. We showed the quote. Someone said, my cousin, my niece, they experienced the exact same thing. We took this quote to the New Mexico Association for the Education of Young Children. Ooh, that's a mouthful. On April 1st of this year, we only had 30 participants in the room because that was all they would let. That was the maximum number of people who could get in the room. In a room full of 30 people, we asked, have any of you had this happen to you, or have you heard about it happening? Guess how many people raised their hand? 14. We heard stories from 20 years ago. We heard stories that are continuing on today. So all too often, Latino families in particular are hearing the misinformation that 2 languages is confusing to children. So let's move on. So a few scenic views. So our affiliate Avance, headquartered in San Antonio, operates 2-generation programs for children and families. They have a very extensive and comprehensive parent-child education program. Parents receive 16 weeks of a curriculum that covers bilingual development, early literacy, and cultural identity in great detail. It's not just an hour. It's multiple weeks of exploring these topics. The program uses a variety of techniques to engage families, like a toy making activity. So parents and children actually make a toy while they're receiving information about the importance of early language development. And in addition to that, they've launched a father engagement initiative this spring to try and bring Latino dads into the picture as well. Next slide. So our affiliate in Forest Grove, Oregon is Adelante Mujeres. It's a small program with many mighty things going on. They do lots of parent advocacy trainings, bringing parents to the state capitol to advocate on behalf of dual language programs. And they put a great deal of support and emphasis into developing the capacity of their teachers. So 9 of their 24 teachers are enrolled in an online AA degree program that's taught entirely in Spanish from Clackamas Community College. If you want to read more about that, everything that I've talked about, including this AA program, all of the links are in the PowerPoint. So at Adelante Mujeres, as well as in many other Unidos US affiliates, there are very high levels of teacher expertise, and the teachers and staff are very strong advocates for bilingualism and cultural responsiveness. Next slide. So we showed the quotes from the speech therapists in Texas, and we asked the teachers in Oregon how they would respond. And these are some of the responses they gave. Such, for example, this advice separates parents and children. It destroys family connections. It cuts children off from their culture. And then, excuse me, speech therapist, but you're misinformed. So the teachers in no uncertain terms rejected the advice that bilingualism is confusing. So I'm out of time. To skip ahead. One of our directions of work is to more directly reach Latino dads with the importance of the early years and the capacity of children for dual language development. And then our central focus, the next slide, please. Our central focus is that there's a large body of scientific evidence that's very clearly stated. Next slide, please. And so the message that we're pushing forward from the US is that children are capable of dual language development. The home language is a resource. The old narrative that two languages are too many needs to be called out and gotten away with. So my final statement is that early bilingual development is super important, and it's much more than learning two languages. It's about identity and identity formation. It's about families and connections between family members and generations. It's about culture, and it's about learning. And it's also about whether children and families feel or miss a sense of belonging. There are a variety of publications that we've done in the last 5 years. The descriptions and the links all follow, but I'm out of time.
Thanks so much, Bob. That was wonderful. We're going to move on to Viorica. So Viorica, take it away.
Thank you. Did you want me to just speak, or did you have some questions?
Yes. I'm so sorry. Yes. So first, tell us, how prevalent is bilingualism and multilingualism in the world?
Okay, great. So I did send you some data on that with some slides that show that although bilingualism is often associated with minority groups, the reality is that bilinguals and multilinguals are the majority of the world population. When we look at the world, more than half of the population speaks two or more languages. It is very common for people all over the world to grow up with two or more languages and then acquire even more languages later in life during schooling or in adulthood. And even here in the United States, the proportion of bilinguals and multilinguals is rapidly growing. It is estimated that about 1/5 of American households speak a language other than English at home. Let's go to the next slide. But actually, those numbers vary by state. Here are some of the data that we compiled for my book that shows the proportion of households where a language other than English is spoken at home. And even these numbers, as you see them, really underreport the proportion of bilinguals, because these are only the households that respond to the census, and also families like mine, where English is the language spoken at home, but the members of the household are not monolingual, are not included. So you can really see that it is very common and increasingly so to speak two or more languages. Next slide. In other countries, so this didn't come through very well here, but the proportion of bilinguals is even higher with, next slide, with students learning, actually growing up with 3 or more languages, as you can see, representing more than half of the world population in Europe. And in some countries, the proportion are in the 90s. Next slide. Yeah, so we do see that bilinguals and multilinguals are the majority of the world population, but they continue to be underrepresented and underserved in research and in clinical and educational services.
And I would imagine, I mean, you cited so much great data there, Viorica, but you mentioned census data, and I'm wondering if you know or have a sense of whether, you know, some of this data on multilingual or bilingual families might even be underreported, that perhaps there are even more bilingual families in the United States.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how bilingualism works in the brain during development.
Sure. So, of course, that's such a broad topic with so many people in labs around the world, including mine, studying it, that we can't do it justice in 10 minutes, which is why I put up the copy of my book there, in which I go into much more depth on this topic. And today I would mention maybe 4 areas worth knowing about when we think about bilingual brains. The first is that when babies are born, their brains are able to distinguish sounds of all languages. And then during the course of the first year of life, their brains become tuned to the sound of their native language, and they lose this ability to hear distinctions between sounds of other languages that do not exist in their native language. So they sort of move from being citizens of the world to being citizens of one country. But babies who grow up with 2 or more languages keep that window of being able to hear sounds of all languages open longer. It's like a perceptual wedge there. And of course, they grow up being able to hear the sounds of all the languages that they've been exposed to. And it is possible to learn to distinguish sounds of all the languages with training later in life, but it's one of the benefits of exposing bilingual babies or babies in general to the sounds of more than one language. So that's the first piece of evidence on the plasticity of the brain growing up with 2 or more languages. The second one is that people used to think that there is this critical period after which one cannot learn a second language. And the locus of the debate was when was the age that this critical period happened. Some people thought 7, others 12, others 14, others 16, 18. But over decades of research, we now know that it is in fact possible to learn another language to fluency at any age. And this critical age hypothesis seem to have been confounded with other variables like education, moving, lots of other things. So there isn't really any solid support and evidence for a critical period hypothesis anymore. So you can learn another language at any time. You may have an accent because of how your articulatory system is set, but we can discuss that later. But you can be fluent, read, understand, produce language to fluency. The third piece of evidence on bilingual brains is that the richness of input is one of the best things that can be done for language learning, for cognitive development, and for brain development more generally. So the richer the input, the better for the brain and for development. The worst thing you can do for a child whose parents speak a different language and are not fluent in the dominant language is to tell them not to speak their native language to the child, and instead to tell them to only speak the second language. Because by doing that, you remove this rich source of input in their native language, this rich vocabulary and phonology and syntax and pragmatics, and replace it with an impoverished linguistic set if the parent is not fluent in that other language. Or sometimes you replace it with passive input only from TV and the internet. And so you really actually do a disfavor to cognitive and neural development, because we do, the richer the input, the richer the kaleidoscope of input that the brain is getting, the better. And then the last piece of evidence there is that knowing 2 or more languages appears to increase white and gray brain matter density. Throughout life, it builds cognitive reserve, and in fact, it even makes it possible to compensate for some of the cognitive declines that can happen sometimes during healthy aging, and that always happens during diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's. So people who speak 2 or more languages are known to be diagnosed and develop symptoms of dementia, behavioral symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's 4 to 6 years later than monolinguals. With bilingualism offering this protective, being a protective sort of system against the cognitive decline. And one way to think about it is if you imagine taking a certain road home from work every day for many years, you go to work, you go back, and you always take this road. And then one day you go on your way home, you discover that this road has collapsed. If there are other roads that have been built to your home over the years and you know about those roads, then you have no problem reaching your destination. But if this is the only road that exists or that you know of, then you have a problem. In the same way, if one neural pathway, one area of the brain has been impacted by disease, bilinguals are able to use other pathways that have been built over a lifetime of memories, experiences, and knowledge to access that information. And I go into a lot more details on this in an accessible way in my new book, The Power of Language, that just came out a month ago and is available in several languages for those who are interested in learning more.
Viorica, thank you so much. And if I can, a little shameless Early Learning Nation plug. I believe we have a story, I think Mark might have included, about how babies process different languages. So I encourage everyone to look on our website and check out some of our stories on bilingualism. Up next, we're going to move on to Martha Martinez. Can you talk a bit about SEAL's approach to learning and how it relates to literacy, Martha?
Sure. And so first of all, I want to say SEAL stands for Broader Early Academic Language. You can go to the next slide and I will talk about our work. So before I launch into that, I want to say first, SEAL is based in California, and our mission is to ensure that all dual language learners and English learners learn, thrive, and they lead. Our why is really based on what the conversation has already primed, which is largely the demographics in California. Many of you know in that slide that Viorica shared previously about the diversity of language, that we have a very diverse population in California. And in the schools, this means a large number of students then who speak a language other than English at home. Collectively, we refer to these students as multilingual learners, and there are other terms that are more specific to segments of the multilingual learner population. The youngest of these, those under age 5, are typically referred to as dual language learners, and in California, they represent 60% of the children. When these children then enter the K-12 system, some of them will become officially classified as English learners. And what that means is they're now entitled to, and schools are required to, provide services to them to help them become proficient in English, but also to provide them access to the grade level content. And in California, 20% of K-12 students are English learners, and almost 30% of K-2 students are English learners. The EL status, this term, though, it's not supposed to be a long-term status. The goal is for students to reclassify eventually as English proficient students. However, too many of these students remain classified as English learners for 6 or more years. And these students are oftentimes referred to as long-term English learners. And again, in California, this is another issue where we have almost half of the students who enter kindergarten who remain as long-term English learners for 6 years or more. So SEAL was created to specifically address this problem, and specifically the long-term English learner problem, and really help our schools foster the linguistic genius of multilingual learners instead of squash it. Next slide, please. So the ways in which SEAL supports literacy, excuse me, is this the right? Yeah. So in 2008, SEAL was piloted in 3 Bay Area schools, and the focus was on this P3 approach. And there was a reason for that, and that was this understanding that Dr. Lori Olson, who created SEAL, understood, is we want to start early. We recognize the power of these initial years of schooling. Since then, SEAL has now expanded into the later years of the upper elementary schools. And in this slide, you'll see the SEAL model and the whole school strategy. And you'll see in the middle, the green circle and the representation of students who are at the core of our work, and the outcomes that we seek for these students, which is joyful, rigorous language and learning and dual language literacy, ideally. And then in the circle just outside that is really our core work with educators, which is about culturally and linguistically responsive curriculum. It's about a research-based and asset-based approach. It's about strong family partnerships, and it is about sustained and embedded professional learning for both teachers and coaches. In the past few years, SEAL has expanded its work beyond what we call then the full model, and we're now providing professional development besides this offering. So next slide, please. So the way in which SEAL supports biliteracy development is manyfold. There's this intentional focus on rich oral language. We emphasize the integration of knowledge content learning with language and literacy development, the importance of leveraging the home language, of including via cross-language connections or meta-language awareness. There's a strong emphasis in joy in learning, the importance of bringing joy into the learning process and into literacy development. And as I mentioned before, we have this ideal goal of biliteracy, both English literacy as well as home language literacy. And there's a clip now that I'd like to show that gives you a sense of what our work entails in a bilingual preschool.
Ok, ¿quién quiere compartir con nosotros? A ver, ¿en qué son diferentes la mariquita de la abeja? A ver, Joseph.
De los puntitos negros y de los rayas es diferente.
Son diferentes. A ver, son diferentes. Entonces digamos, la mariquita es diferente de la abeja porque la mariquita tiene
Puntos
negros y la abeja tiene rayas negras. Excelente. Ok, Emilia.
No son iguales porque la mariquita tiene rojas para cuidarse las transparent wings y la abeja no tiene otras alas rojas o azules para que se cuiden las transparentes wings.
Excelente, ¿entendieron eso? La mariquita tiene sus élitros que son rojos para proteger las alas transparentes, pero la abeja no. Excelente, Emilia, muy bien.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Martha. Wondering if you can dig in, there's been a lot of recent discussion at the national level around the science of reading. How do you view this, and where do you see SEAL's contribution to this movement?
Yeah, thank you. And SEAL has actually become more actively involved in this literacy conversation, and it really is the purpose of our role has been to highlight multilingual learners in the literacy movement, and including their needs and the gaps that we see in practice, definitely, but also in the research. And those gaps really have to do in a variety of ways, but one that we're focusing on today really has to do with bilingualism, bilingual education, and biliteracy development. Since its inception, SEAL has recognized these connections that were really highlighted in this report here, Reading for Understanding Initiative report that was based upon federal research to really strengthen reading comprehension in the country. And this research was actually conducted as a result of our efforts with Reading First and the fact that we didn't see significant impacts in reading comprehension. And so there was this new wave of federal research to really deepen our understanding of how do we effectively get to deep reading comprehension. And the headlines from this report really kind of encapsulate our work, which is understanding these strong connections between knowledge, language, and literacy development, as well as the fact that reading really is this inherently cultural activity, and you have to understand the setting in which this happens, the context, the genre, and so forth. So we've entered this phase because we saw that multilingual learners were kind of being their needs were not necessarily being prioritized, and that's what we're about. So one thing that we have done, and you can go to the next slide, and if you don't mind then putting the link to one of the reports or one of the papers that we recently authored, which has to do with early literacy development and instruction for dual language learners. And so we've become a part of the National Committee for Effective Literacy to help kind of elevate the issues of multilingual learners and about their needs and the strong connections between language literacy and content.
Thank you so much, Martha. And we encourage everyone to check out that report. And I believe we have a link to that as well. Up next, we have Claude Goldenberg. Claude, you've been writing and researching for some time now about teaching multilingual students. What do you see as the most effective practices for English learners?
Thanks, Lee, for that question. And thanks to everyone for attending and to my colleagues for this important conversation. You know, before I get to your question, I just want to tag on to some of the comments that we've heard previously that Martha got us into explicitly about bilingual education. One thing that people don't realize is there's an American tradition of bilingual education that is generally overlooked. Hattie's going to put some references in the chat. One paper that I would recommend that people take a look at, and it's not behind a paywall, so she's going to put the link up there, is something I wrote with a student a few years ago, Bilingual Education, Reviving an American Tradition. Most people don't realize that bilingual education has been part of the American landscape since before the United States was the United States. Would anyone care to guess what the first bilingual program was? English and what other language? If you're so bold, put it in the chat. I see German, that's a good guess. German's an excellent guess. Dutch is good, German, Irish, Gaelic, French. Okay, those are all decent guesses because there have been bilingual education programs. No, but it's Polish, because in the 17th century, those who came to what is now the United States wanted to start a shipping empire, and Polish ship makers were among the best in the world. So they imported Polish ship makers into the Virginia colony, I think it was, and they wanted bilingual education for their children. So Polish and English were the first bilingual programs hundreds of years ago. Since then, there's been a steady presence of bilingual education in the United States, with a couple of exceptions during and after World War I, when there was a tremendous amount of anti-German sentiment. And as people have guessed, German bilingual programs were probably the most prevalent in the 19th century. But there was a larger portion of children in bilingual education programs in the 19th century than there is currently in the United States. So there's a long tradition of bilingual education in the United States. And the title of our article is Reviving an American Tradition. So enough said about how I support what we heard in the past few speakers. It's a tradition, it's a resource that we are not taking full advantage. The home language, we have over 400 home languages in the United States, some obviously far more prevalent than others, but it's a linguistic and cultural, intellectual resource that we're not fully taking advantage of. So the article, I hope, I can't see the chat, but I think, how do you put it in? And there's a Spanish version of it that you will also put in the chat. But I'm going to take a slightly different angle here, because a lot of what we've heard really has to do with bilingualism in terms of oral language. And Martha certainly brought in the issue of bilingual education, which includes literacy. But I want to make the point here that there's an important distinction to be made between oral language and written language that I think sometimes gets overlooked. In fact, frequently gets overlooked. And the next link that Hattie's going to put in the chat is to a blog that I recently did, saying that oral language and written language are not the same. I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail, but let me just give you a couple of key points. Oral language, otherwise known as speech, has been part of the human species for about 300,000 years, give or take 10, 20, maybe 50,000 years, as far as the archaeological record can determine. Written language, or print, is a far more recent human invention. It's only about 5,000 years old. And those were hieroglyphics, cuneiform. There were logographic orthographies that represented concepts. Now, the languages we're most used to now, and about 90% of languages have, if they have an orthography at all, and some do not have orthographies, not all languages have written languages corresponding to them, but most languages are alphabetic languages, where you have sound symbol association, where the speech of the language, the oral language, is somehow transcribed into written form. That is a much more recent development in the human species. And unlike oral language, with which we are equipped with the brain equipment to understand, make sense of, and eventually produce, written language is not intuitively understandable to the human species. Those little marks we make on the paper or on the screen are not intuitively understandable. You've got to learn, you've got to be taught one way or another. Some people pick it up very quickly, almost intuitively. Some people require a lot of work. But literacy is not something that we acquire naturally in the same way that we acquire oral language. So you have to understand the distinction between oral language, which comes in through our ears and is processed differently in the brain. I'm not the brain scientist on the panel. Viorka is, and I would welcome her insights on this. I don't know the difference between my earlobe and my prefrontal lobe, but I've read some neurolinguistic research, and I've discussed with Ken Pugh, a very prominent neuropsychologist and neurolinguist, that essentially the brain circuitry has got to be created in the brain in order to connect the sounds of the language with the written representations of the language, with the semantics of the language. And unless you create that brain circuitry to enable literacy, reading and writing, then literacy is literally impossible. Now, the question comes up, what about deaf people? What about people who don't hear as well? They have to do workarounds. Again, I'm not an expert in this field, but from what I've read, they have to accomplish the same thing, but it's much more difficult because they either can't hear or hear within a limited range of frequency. Perhaps Viorka can enlighten us on this. But the idea of connecting the sounds to the symbols and then to the semantics, the meaning of the language, is fundamental for understanding how people learn to read and the kind of support that they need if they're learning to read in a language they are simultaneously learning. Which then gets us, I'm sorry, Leah, took a very roundabout way to answer your question. What we know about English learners learning to read in English, which is a language that they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand, is they need additional support. They need additional support so that they understand the words that are being used to teach them to read, and they become familiar with the sounds, the phonology of a language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. Now, notice I'm talking now about if they're learning to read in a language they're learning to speak and understand. If they're in a bilingual program where they're learning to read in a language they already know, that's a different set of issues. We can talk about that at some point if people want to explore it, but I'm really referring to the fact that the vast majority of children in the United States are learning to read in a language they are simultaneously learning to speak and understand, and they need additional support. You know, think about it, a 5, 6, 7-year-old who speaks English and is learning to read in English, they understand. They have in their spoken vocabulary most of the language, most of the words that are being used to teach them to read. Words like cat or bat or run or see. Those are in their vocabulary by and large. There are exceptions if there are developmental delays, but by and large, children of that age understand the language that's being used to teach them to read. Well, there's a reason English learners are called English learners, because they're learning the language. And if they don't know the meanings of the words, they can't accomplish the fundamental task, which is sometimes called orthographic mapping in the reading education world, of connecting phonology, sound, orthography, symbol, and semantics, the meaning. Those are the constituent elements of the brain circuitry that's got to be constructed to enable literacy. Now, one of the questions that were raised in the question and answer was, what about the science of reading, and whether the science of reading focus tends to be on students learning to read in English and what's being used to change the narrative. So let me try to clarify here. Science of reading is very often used in a very, shall we say, villainous sort of way, as if the science of reading and bilingualism, bilingual education are at odds with each other, and one is trying to undermine the other. I think nothing can be further from the truth, because we know, whether you call it science of reading or reading research, whatever name you use, unfortunately, science of reading has become sort of this lightning rod, which just sort of evokes a lot of animosity and discussions and conversation. But reading research throughout the world has demonstrated that if you're learning to read in a language that you're simultaneously learning to speak and understand, you need additional support. But in no way can that be interpreted as suggesting you have to learn to read in a second language. You can learn, you should learn to read in your first language. You should maintain the first language, extend skills in the first language, as well as acquire a second or a third. As Viorica told us, a lot of kids, a lot of individuals are trilingual. The United States is really behind the curve here in terms of its linguistic capabilities. So there's nothing about the science of reading and bilingualism, bilingual education that should be at odds with each other. And if anyone suggests that, it's because they really don't know the research. And that's one of the problems.
I think we're going to, I love what you're saying. I think this is a great topic to bring into our panel discussion, because I'm sure folks would love to talk about this conflict between the science of reading and bilingualism. So thank you again. And I also loved that historic bit about Polish bilingualism in the United States. Didn't know that. So like I said, we're going to move into our panel discussion. From a policy standpoint, what should state and federal policymakers do to ensure equitable learning for bilingual and multilingual learners? So I'll just open it up to the floor, whoever would like to start.
I'll start if no one else is going to jump in, and say, I'm really grateful for this session and the focus on multilingual learners and on bilingualism and its link to biliteracy. I want to say that the reason we, as I mentioned before, SEAL got into this conversation is because the way in which the science of reading has been interpreted by some schools, the way in which the research has been narrowed has been a concern, and the way in which it gets misinterpreted as being all about the word recognition side of the reading comprehension equation. And so we're hopeful that because of sessions like this, because of elevating the needs of multilingual learners, because of elevating the value and the asset of bilingualism, and because of the growing number of bilingual programs across the country, that we become much better about enacting the research basis and conducting more research on effective bilingual education and biliteracy development. Because I do believe there's gaps in our knowledge, which have to do with the way in which the country has stifled bilingual education in some states by banning it in some states for many years, and now just opening up these possibilities again.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned parts of the country that have banned this or stifled this. I want to take it in the other direction. Martha, and anyone else can answer this. Where do we see policies that effectively support English learners?
California has a great EL roadmap. And so there was an English learner roadmap that was created really to center again the needs, assets of multilingual learners. I think, as you heard from Bob in his presentation earlier, and definitely in our work with schools, that we continue to see a lack of of knowledge about how to best serve these students. It's oftentimes left out of even policies in the name of science of reading, some training for teachers around how to serve multilingual learners. We are constantly facing this battle around English language development for ELs and making sure students have access to that. So we know the research there is out there, and it says that, that this is the best way to teach these students, but we're not always seeing it be enacted. And it's tough for teachers who are constantly pulled from one political kind of pendulum to another. So, so I do want to not make it seem like it's all the teacher's fault. They're constantly caught in this battle of, okay, now you just have to do this and you have to do it in this way. And we've got to provide our teachers with a lot more support and policies than that recognize the complexity of learning and the diversity of our population.
So Lee, if I could jump in with a, let's say, complementary perspective. I think actually California is in a very difficult and not very positive position with respect to education of English, well, education in general. And one of the reasons is precisely the premise of the question that I was responding to, that for too long, there's been this unnecessary sense in which science of reading, or whatever you call it, I really have come to despise the term because it's just this lightning rod that just creates animosity. There's been this perceived contradiction between reading research in general and the needs of English learners. And the fact is that there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the two. And we've been trying to work on some common ground documents. Martha has been involved in some things that I've been involved in, but we still can't get away from this idea that English learners learn in a fundamentally different way. It's simply not true. There's a tremendous amount of overlap between how English learners learn, whether it's in their home language or in a second language, and the way English monolingual learners learn. One perfect example of this is a lot of children, we know we can identify who are at risk for potential reading difficulties based on some early screening instruments. Now, for various reasons, some of which are understandable, there's been a tremendous amount of opposition among a lot of EL advocates, bilingual advocates, to any kind of screening. Partly this is because in the past, children have been over-identified, which certainly doesn't serve anyone's purpose, much less the children's. But we have much better instruments now than we did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the fact that we're not systematically screening children for potential reading difficulties, I'm not saying the D word, I'm not saying dyslexia, I'm saying potential reading difficulties. We have a vast literature in all sorts of languages suggesting that we can identify kids who are at risk and we can provide interventions. Some of the best studies done have been doing interventions, Sharon Vaughn studies, Linnea Airy studies. These are smack dab in the middle of the science of reading. But these studies tend to get relegated to irrelevance because a lot of the English learner bilingual education advocates think it's not relevant for for bilingual, emergent bilinguals. It is very relevant. We're just not taking into account as much as we should.
Mm-hmm. This is something that I want to loop back because Martha had talked about, this is what's happening at the policy level, political level maybe, and then the challenges here for teachers in the classroom. What should happen in the classroom level to support multilingual students? Bob, I don't know if you want to jump in here. I feel like you've had, some hands-on classroom experience. Maybe you can talk about this.
So I'm too tired to jump, but I'll try and take a few meaningful strides. In the teacher focus groups that we did in 2018, we asked once we got the focus group up and running and the teachers got comfortable, we said, what do good teachers do? And they said, a wide variety of things, but in 10 different groups around the United States, they kept coming back to this idea of creating a sense of belonging. So Kansas City, Philadelphia, Red Granite, Wisconsin, people kept saying, we need a sense of belonging. If we don't do that at the very beginning of the school year, And if we don't do that at the beginning of every day, we're really losing the opportunity for instruction or learning. And they talked about, you know, children coming in with lots of energy, excited, happy, the same child the next day coming in crying. They talked about the variety of things that they see in children. And they talked about the importance of establishing a sense of belonging at the beginning of the year and as a daily first step in the morning. They talked about if we don't attend to children's immediate needs as soon as they enter the classroom, they talked about losing the whole day because one child's trauma or experiences would spill over and influence other children in the group. So that they articulated a variety of strategies that they use to do that. Those were preschool teachers, but I think that the K-12 world would do well to think about what's it like for children to walk in the morning, and could 5 minutes of attention to their state of being as they cross the threshold, could that make a difference in reading outcomes?
So these are more,
that document is on our website too. So
this sounds like more just emotional support basically versus even academic support, if I'm reading that correctly.
So there's the emotional component, but what another piece that we learned is what really came out from looking at all the transcripts and all the comments is how connected all the different developmental domains are. So people talk about social emotional learning these days as though it were something separate, but in our experience, when children are learning, when they're excited, when they're learning, they're excited, and it's a great boost to their social emotional development. So when children accomplish something, whether it's a physical task or they learn a new word or they play around with an idea, there's this connectedness to their social emotional state. And so, you know, children are aware that they've learned something, and it's a major boost to their social emotional. So I think David Dickinson has really done the best work at the early childhood level, talking about how language and social emotional development are different aspects of one developmental continuum rather than separate pieces of one child.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to move on talking about, markers of success. Traditionally, third grade has long been this marker of academic success. The recent research has shown that kindergarten is a key milestone. So wondering what factors should we consider for bilingual children as they reach these crucial ages? Viorica, I'm wondering maybe if you can take this. I feel like this is more about maybe what's happening inside the brain, as kids are developing and reaching these different stages.
I think it would probably be better for someone who works in the classroom with children to talk about this from a neuroscientific perspective. Of course, the earlier you introduce the two languages, the better. So ideally, you want to develop both languages in parallel. Two-way immersion programs are known to be particularly successful in supporting both the academic, the linguistic, the cognitive, the social development of children, and those the very successful ones tend to start at kindergarten and go throughout, but the more years you support bilingual education, the better. So, saying, well, third year, kindergarten, first grade, it's a little bit arbitrary, because I think we want to work towards a goal of supporting bilingual dual language education long term. And advocate towards education resources, not at the individual schools and school district level, but really at the national level for this understanding that bilingualism, bilingual education does not mean education in another language or speaking another language. It really means education in two languages, and has advantages, not just for the individual, but for the entire society at the national level.
Mhm. Would anyone else like to add on to that, in terms of the classroom experience here?
Yeah, I would, Lee, if I can jump in. And this is a good question, and it reminds me, and Hattie, if you can put this in the link, the American Federation of Teachers publishes this very good publication, American Educator, which is not behind a paywall, so anyone can access it. And there's going to be an issue coming out that'll be online August the 10th, so still a couple of months, directed at parents and families. And there's a chunk of those articles that'll be devoted to the parents and families of English learners at different levels, from preschool to middle and high school. And one of the things we try to address there is what are the kind of things that parents, primarily parents, but I think it's relevant for teachers, obviously, should be looking for. Now, at the moment, there's a draft of some guideposts that I've sort of sketched together. It's still not clear whether they're going to make their way into the publication, all sorts of publication issues. I'd be happy to send a draft of it to anyone who emails me. But the bottom line there is that the markers are really the same. The major difference, as far as I can tell, and I want to hear from some SLPs in the audience, the major difference, as far as I can tell, is that when children in a bilingual environment, and you're counting words and MLUs and those sorts of things, which are pretty known markers of sort of language development, there's wide variation and and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, they're used to, the pediatricians and SLPs and teachers use to track progress. It's basically the same milestones, except that if you're growing up in a bilingual environment, you got to count the words in both languages. So a child might have fewer words in English and fewer words in Spanish than a monolingual kid in Spanish. But if you add them together, it should be at least that number, if not more. So that's the major accommodation, because the amount of language being understood, the amount of language being produced, it should be roughly the same, regardless of whether it's a bilingual, trilingual, or monolingual household. And then when it comes to literacy, the same sorts of things you're looking for. Are they orienting to books, right? That's a very clear indication of whether there's literacy in the home, which is a very important thing. I don't need to remind anyone. Can they write their name? Are they starting to write letters like individual letters, and then later letters to grandma and grandpa and so forth? So the markers are really the same, regardless of bilingual or monolingual or trilingual, but you have to keep in mind the variance. You can't get too rigid, but I think it's a good table to look at, particularly if there's some reason for concern. And if there is, you need to go to a professional, a pediatrician, a speech language pathologist, hopefully not the ones that Bob cited, who provided the misinformation, which is a whole nother issue. But there are some guideposts that we can suggest, and I think I hope it shows up in the article that we published, but if not, then write to me and I'll send it to you. It's a draft, so nothing, it's not the last word on anything.
Okay. Thank you so much, Claude. We're going to move on to some of our questions from the audience. So I'm going to go ahead. Our first one is for Viorica. For data on multilingual people, do you have data outside of Europe and outside of Africa?
Yes. So, but what kind of data? There are now bilingualism labs all around the world. The European Union keeps particularly good tabs and tracks on bilingual education, proportion of bilinguals and multilinguals. But of course, there are other countries around the world that are multilingual, where more than one language is actually the official languages. India, Singapore, Canada, most countries in Asia, actually. So yeah, it depends on what data we're looking for.
And I'm going to, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I'm going to stay with you here on another question. Does multilingualism improve aspects of executive function, such as cognitive flexibility?
That's a really good question. So there is now a significant body of research that shows that bilinguals and multilinguals perform better on executive function tasks. And what I mean by that is, because bilinguals have to constantly juggle more than one language and control what language they're going to produce, this constant juggling The argument is because they have experience with inhibiting and facilitating languages. Experience with language translates to domain general cognitive advantages in inhibitory control, facilitation, executive function more generally. So paying attention to information that matters and ignoring information that doesn't matter. The difference is that the advantages are particularly strong during early development and then later in life, during aging, when there is a lot more variability in cognitive performance. I must say that not all studies around the world find executive function advantages in bilinguals and multilinguals. So there have been some studies that did not find any differences. And so the question now that we are trying to answer is, what aspects of bilingualism improve what aspects of executive function and under what circumstances, to really try to take a more specific, not black and white approach. I think many people would tend to want a very clear-cut black or white answer. Is it improving executive function? Is it not? But bilinguals are not all the same. Bilingualism is a diversity of experiences. Many of us here are bilingual or trilingual, but our experiences are very different. And age at which we acquired languages, how manner of acquisition, current fluency, current frequency of use, all of those variables of language experience influence different aspects of cognition. So we can't really ask this yes/no questions. And I think that's where we have problems when we have this misguided question, well, is bilingualism good for you? Yes, it's good for lots of things, but of course, nothing is universally good or bad. So that's really not the right way to answer questions. It's to really look at what aspects of language experience change what aspects of cognitive function. And it seems that a regular experience using two languages does translate to improve executive function performance.
Thanks.
And most of this work, just in case people would like more references, is being done by Ellen Bialystok's research group in Canada and her collaborators around the world.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Our next question is for Bob. What would you recommend as far as a bridge between early childhood and school pipelines for bilingual families?
So that's a good one. I would say that I'll restate the statement I meant before about people going to school, learning to become teachers, not being taught anything about dual language development or the importance of culture. It just seems to be a shame and a real waste. So we have a terrific amount of research reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences, whether people are going into early childhood, the early elementary years. Everyone needs a good grounding in dual language development, cultural aspects, and etc. So I think that teacher preparation that I mentioned originally is super important. And then the other component is really about leadership. So a long time ago, like the earliest years of the 21st century, I was working with as a consultant with a migrant Head Start program in Oregon. And their relationships with the Portland public schools were excellent. So there was a real commitment amongst school administrators to operate dual language programs. I believe they were K-3, so it wasn't the full gamut, but there were quarterly meetings between the Head Start program and the schools, cooperation. School officials were respectful and eager to collaborate with the Head Start program. You don't see that in a lot of other places around the world. So not surprisingly, Portland Public Schools has been operating immersion programs in 4 languages for quite a while: Spanish, Chinese, Russian, and Japanese. And there was a study by RAND Corporation that showed, much better than expected outcomes for children in their primary languages as well as in their second languages. So reading scores at 8th grade, I believe, were well above national norms, and et cetera. The challenge is that a lot of times those kinds of high quality experiences are not disseminated throughout language minority communities. So when the Chinese immersion program first began, 500 parents camped out for 50 spaces. So a lot of times the immersion slots go to relatively wealthy white families, and reaching the full population of minority communities and language minority communities is not the primary focus of the policy. So we need ECE, kindergarten, elementary years. We need access to high quality programs, bilingual programs, and then the teacher preparation that takes the science into account.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. Martha, not to open it up to this lightning rod, as Claude has called it, but this is a question about the science of reading. So how's the science of reading movement ensuring bilingualism and biliteracy is seen as an asset or goal? In this country, the focus of science of reading tends to be on students reading in English. What is being done to change this narrative?
Well, we're trying to change the narrative, Seal is. I think it's important to understand that that education is a very political entity, and bilingual education has been a pawn of this politics since the inception. So yes, we had wonderful bilingual education programs that have existed since, and I'm really, thanks Claude for the Polish history lesson too. I thought it was German as well. But we know too that the rights of language minority populations have been rescinded at various times. In California, when SEAL first was started in California, it was under the bilingual education ban that was operative in California. So we really couldn't push a bilingual education at that time. But then since then, that ban was repealed, and there is an emphasis right now on this bilingualism as an asset. And as I mentioned before, there is this growing number of these programs. And as Bob alluded to, oftentimes students then who we are about, multilingual learners, are shut out of these programs. And so what we're trying to do is elevate the needs and the research base around how best to serve these students. What we have witnessed is that the research base about how best to serve these students is not always enacted, and that policies sometimes prevent the enactment of effective instructional policies. So we've entered this conversation to center these students and to talk about equity with respect to their access to effective instructional practices based on research that honors their whole being, including their cultural and linguistic background.
Thanks so much for that, Martha. Our next question is for Claude. An attendee's district has a dual language program, but whether the child is a native speaker of Spanish, Haitian Creole, or English, they are required to withdraw if their English language testing was not high enough at a prescribed time. Is that a good policy, or is it a question of the child just needing more time to develop literacy skills in the newly acquired language?
Well, first of all, it doesn't sound to me like a very good policy, but I always hate to make judgments like that without knowing relevant contextual factors. I'd want to know what kind of instruction they're receiving, and that'd be the most important thing, and what the larger context is, but primarily the instruction. I mean, part of the problem is, and if I can just sort of refer back to your question and to Martha's answer, part of the problem is that people tend to look at research in very siloed ways. They look at the bilingual education research, they'll look at the science of reading research, and they don't look across. And people say, we got to look at the research. Well, you got to look at the research comprehensively. You got to look at research that is relevant for what the questions you're trying to answer. And so to the question, Lee, that the person asked, I mean, I want to know what kind of instruction they're getting. I mean, people for too long have assumed that reading proficiency is a maturational process. Okay, there are maturational factors involved. Right, we know that. But it's really very, very dependent on environmental input. And chief among those environmental inputs is instruction. So if you have a kid who's having traction learning to read in a first, second, third, nth language, the first thing I'd want to find out is what kind of instruction are they receiving? And if they're receiving crappy instruction, then it's no surprise they're having difficulty getting traction. If they're receiving really good instruction, and we can talk about what that constitutes, and they're having difficulty getting traction, then you need to go into, there's the multi-tiered systems support framework. You have tier 1 instruction, which is really solid classroom instruction. Kids having difficulty need to receive what's called tier 2 instruction, sort of early intervention. We're not yet at special ed. Special ed is when they're sort of instructionally resistant. But if you're not getting the right traction with the instruction you're getting, what's happening next? This is a more intensive attempt to get the kid on track. So without knowing that, I mean, I wouldn't want to make a judgment. It just sounds to me that in general, if you're waiting for kids to mature to get something, then you're probably on the wrong track.
Mm-hmm. I want to open up the next question to the entire panel. Have panel members heard of parents of dual language learners insisting that their children only learn to speak English? Is this the result of, quote, toxic misinformation, and/or is this what parents were taught by their parents?
So I'll jump in on that one. So a colleague of mine at George Mason University was Wayne Thomas and Ginger Collier. They did a long-term longitudinal study. They looked at 1 million children's school records for a long time. And I had the good fortune of personally receiving updates to their data. They went to Oregon. There was the availability of early dual language classrooms. There were several, if I'm remembering correctly, there were several hundred families who signed waivers saying we only want our children instructed in English. The idea that English was the pathway to success was so ingrained. The message that Spanish was a barrier to success was so ingrained. Parents went out of their way to sign a piece of paper saying, I want my child in English only instruction. And the outcomes data on those children in reading and math was bad. It was toxic. That was part of their bigger report that came out. Like, we've had this for decades and we're still not moving beyond it. But so that was sort of like no researcher could introduce that kind of negativity into a research study, but because the parents had voluntarily signed the waivers, they were able to track the outcomes and see the impacts on the children.
I'd like to add to that to make sure that we are clear that we can't really vilify those parents. Most of these parents are coming from a good place. They love their children. They want the best for their children. And because they themselves have been subject to discrimination of various kind, in part because of their language abilities, because of their accent, because of their bilingual linguistic status. Of course, there are other things as well. They don't wish that for their children, and they are trying to do what best they can to prevent their children from being victims of the same discrimination and biases. So we can't go into this blame the victim situation. The parents are living with their own experiences and are trying to protect their children. And part of this does come from misinformed pediatricians, misinformed educators who do continue to say, and I have been told that myself, to not speak their native language to your child because it will confuse them. So I think the education, yes, these parents can benefit from a gentle correction of the misinformation they've been given. But they are preparing their children to live in the world that is discriminating against people who speak with an accent quite often or who are not fluent in English in this country. So I think the education should really intend and focus on this clinicians, speech language pathologists, learning disability specialists, teachers, nurses, doctors, and really at the broader level as a society through the publications you're all sharing, through books, to help correct this misinformation. And decreasing the environment, the racism and discrimination that of the environment into which these children are being brought up to is the key here.
If I could add one other element in defense of parents, there's a version of common sense, that says English is the language of success, and the more and earlier you're immersed in English, the more chances of success you have. So while everything that Bob and Viorka said, I think is true, there are also very deep-seated beliefs that parents have that don't necessarily come from misinformation, but just come from a version of common sense that I think, research has tried to, with varying degrees, tried to dispel. But I'm originally from Argentina, and I'm positive that when I came to the States at 3, if bilingual education had been offered, my parents would not have put me in bilingual education. Now, their reasoning was, we want our child to learn English, we'll take care of the Spanish, because I also grew up bilingual because my parents only spoke to me in Spanish. They were not concerned about confusion. They were concerned about the school trying to do something they probably couldn't do very well, and that they could do better. So parents come from, different perspectives, but they do have their set of beliefs. They're not blank slates, just like 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds are not blank slates. And you have to acknowledge whatever sort of assumptions they have and versions of common sense.
One of the things that I found effective, one of the points that I found effective when parents ask me whether they should speak their native language to their child is to point out this differences in social economic status. Because when you look at the upper class families in the United States, upper middle class families as well, they understand the value of learning another language. They hire tutors for their children. They send their children on programs abroad, exchange programs, semester abroad programs, enrichment language classes of all kind of varieties. And then you have, on the other hand, the lower socioeconomic status families who often are being told to not speak a native language at home. So they have this built-in option of having more than one language. So once I think you point that out to some parents, that look, you are getting for free these advantages that some people have to pay lots of money to get, that can help.
That's very much aligned with our work. So we specifically work with parents around where the myths around bilingual education, but also empower them to be advocates for their children so that they can also evaluate the programs that they're getting, because we want the children, we want to make sure they understand, we want their children to become biliterate, right? This is not then just about, it is the importance of preserving this beautiful asset that connects you with your family, but it is about then how you succeed in this country. And the way you succeed in this country is you're academically successful. And the way to be academically successful is you have to be literate. And so these are core issues that we do talk about with families. Here's the research. Here's the benefits of bilingualism. Speak to them in your language. Preserve that, and hopefully advocate for a bilingual program, and then make sure that bilingual program is a high quality program
that teaches literacy well.
Yes, in both languages.
I want to move on to one of our last questions before we wrap up here, although I'm fascinated by this topic alone. So this is a question for the whole panel. How do we support early learning educators who didn't go through a teacher preparation program?
With difficulty, but essentially, I mean, we really have to. A lot of people, particularly the alternative certification programs that exist, just like teacher preparation programs that exist, are of variable quality based on variable parts of the research. I mean, this has been a very important issue in literacy education in particular, which is not to say it's not important in other areas as well. And as you know, there's a tremendous amount of activity around making sure that people who teach literacy courses, early literacy and later literacy, understand the research, the relevant research, whether it's with monolinguals or bilinguals or trilinguals around the world and domestically. It's a big challenge. And if they've gone through an alternative program, I guess it's probably a bigger challenge, because as little time is spent in traditional bilingual education, or rather teacher preparation is what I meant. As little time is spent in teacher preparation on literacy education, there's a great risk of even less time is spent in alternative programs where people are interns and get a lot of online classes. So I'm really not answering your question other than saying it's something we really need to pay attention to, whether they're traditionally trained, alternatively trained, or are emergency certified, which we're seeing more and more because there's a real teacher crisis in terms of the teaching force, and a lot of people going to teaching with emergency certification. So in-service professional development is becoming increasingly important.
Anyone else have anything to add on that?
We've actually provided professional development specifically then to address early learning professionals and dual language learners. It was a state-funded grant that allowed us to do this work. And I have to tell you that there was a couple of wonderful things that were enlightening for us, which is that there's much more cultural and linguistic diversity amongst the early learning workforce in general. So there's this amazing asset. And so bringing then this knowledge about bilingualism, biliteracy, and the importance of starting early about language and its relationship then to knowledge, content, all of that to this population, we felt like here's this amazing resource that we could build from. And they were also so appreciative of the professional learning. That's another thing we're just kind of starting to do, is recognize the importance of this workforce and the need to provide them with professional learning and time for this professional learning within their work schedule.
Bob, I want to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think now you've covered the educational aspects of it, but I think an important way to support educators and bilingual programs and all these issues we discussed today is to continue to make sure that we keep them visible in public conversation, that then they are not relegated to this fringe side movement, but are really increasingly entering the conversation that the majority of the population is having, not just the bilinguals themselves or the bilingual teachers themselves. And one way to do this is to really share your experiences, share your needs, share your personal experiences as a bilingual educator, because some are not aware of all the issues that this community is facing and the importance of mainstreaming bilingualism in ways that's beneficial.
Well, I want to thank all the members of our panel today for taking their time. This was a really fascinating discussion. And before I hop off here, just want to remind everyone who's still in the webinar that Hattie has launched a survey poll for participants where you guys can share your feedback. So if you can fill that out before everyone logs off, that would be great.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our moderator. Thank you to everyone in the chat. We had so many wonderful questions that we couldn't get to them all today, but I really appreciate everyone's engagement. And I just wanted to give a last reminder about our upcoming webinars, as well as a reminder to save the date for our GLR week coming up next month. I will be sending out follow-up materials this week with all of the slides, all of the resources that were shared in the chat, as well as a recording to this session for anyone who wants to share it around. Thank you to everyone for being here today, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Hattie, and your team.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you. Thank you for participating.